Nath is
Hi.
who is taken the initiative to host this, and Pranada is with the Parvati Foundation, and she's joining us from Canada. And yeah, thank you, Pranada, for joining us today.
Happy to jump in.
Yeah. Okay, let's start now. Good afternoon, everybody. We all have assembled here to participate in the international webinar on polar warming impacts and implications for us. It is organized by the Department of Botany, Dhing College, in association with the IQAC and Eco Club, Dhing College. Respected Dr. Guy, respected ma'am, respected Dr. Biman Hazarika, Principal, Dhing College, and Rituraj Kukan, my close friend and once class schoolmate. My esteemed participants from different parts of India and abroad, my students and the audience. At the very outset, I welcome you all to this webinar. Now I request Dr. Biman Hazarika, principal of our college, to formally inaugurate the webinar. It's now over to Dr. Biman Hazarika, sir. Please, you inaugurate the webinar.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Sanjeev Kumar Nath, host of this webinar. Good afternoon to everyone who have joined here in this international webinar being organized by our Department of Botany in association with Internal Quality Assurance Cell Dhing College and Eco Club. Today, we have with us two eminent environmentalists, naturalists, whom we know from very near past. They are Dr. Guy Tane and one of my favorite writers, Rituraj Kukan. Welcome you all here in this webinar being hosted by our Department of Botany at Dhing College in Nagaon. Dhing College is located in the northwest part of the Nagaon, which is not far from the birthplace of Mahapurush Srimad Shankar Deva, the great Vaishnavite saint of Assam and Northeast. We have a big river here, that is River Brahmaputra, which flows besides only 2 kilometers away from our institution. Environmentally, we are not so much rich as in other parts of the state, but we are very lucky enough having Brahmaputra in our skin near thing. Anyway, the topic of the webinar is very interesting and which is taking a center stage now, right now, that is polar warming impact implications for us. And I must say one thing, and it's my pleasure to announce here that this is the first international webinar or any conference being hosted by our college, and this is for the first time being hosted by our Department of Botany. I have to mention, I have to quote here, I have to describe here some regarding our resource persons we have joined here and esteemed participants from different parts of the country and abroad as well. Our Professor Dr. Guy, who is now present the chairperson of the Human Nature Network, is It is interesting to observe here that he is now 65, but at these ages, he makes his life skills available for many organizations worldwide. As celebrations of the human nature solutions, he is working a lot in this aspect. And apart from that, he is also the provider of transnational network of services and communications and everything else what is related with these issues, particularly the environmental. Dr. Tannen, who is an eminent environmentalist, as I already mentioned, he is an entrepreneur working all around the globe, and his thesis is very interesting on the construction, structure, and degradation of architecture of woody plant, which is very much effort and much put thesis of his time, and till now it is very lively one, which is very sought after. Anyway, I must say or refer here at least some lines. My compliment to Rituras for joining here. Hello, Rituras. It is known to me, he's very much known to me since last 10 or 12 years, I must say, as an environmental writer and being a subscriber of offline, I always like to find his stories in the pages of Frontline and other environmental related magazines where he is writing. He has been writing since long past. It's my immense pleasure to welcome Mr. Fukan. His mission, work for water, always draws the attention of environmental lovers, environmentalists, naturalists, and everyone. He is a member of IUCN and always concerns about our glacial loss in the water towers of Arctic region, who is taking lead role in mobilizing civil society all through his life. And it's very interesting to note here that he is a commerce graduate, but being a commerce graduate, he is doing a lot in the field of environmental issues. And one important observation that I come across that for the first time, actually he is doing a lot in these aspects, and he's now working as an associate editor of Igniting Mind magazine for the youth, which is being inspired by our late president, APJ Kalam. His blog is very interesting. It is Climate Awareness Report for Arts. This is all about Mr. Fukan and Dr. Taner. Anyway, it would be a very interesting session in this evening, I believe, and I hope. And for this, our host, I must extend my heartfelt thanks to Dr. Sanjeev Kumar Nath, who is doing a lot for this, making this webinar a successful one, and co-host Fukan as well, and other colleagues of this department, that is Andrew Deka Bora, HOD of Botany, Dr. Manoj Kumar Sekia, who is presently the coordinator of Internet Quality Assurance Cell in college, and other associates who have put their energies and resources in making this webinar a successful one. And with these words, I must conclude my deliberations, a little briefing, and I offer this August webinar forum to our honorable resource persons who have joined us in this webinar. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Biman Hazarika, principal of our college, for his deliberation. And now let us go to the next program. And now I request Dr. Guy, our tenor, to deliver his valuable lecture. So before you start your lecture, I would like to give a bio sketch of Dr. Guy R. Tanner. Born a poor post-war baby boomer, a product of the English National Health Service, the English state free education system, and the values still personified by Her Majesty Elizabeth II. Sir David Attenborough at the Natural History Museum. Dr. Tanner is an independent social and environmental entrepreneur, consultant, and human nature community coach. A graduate in biochemistry from Liverpool University, famous School of Biochemistry, he headed off to Scotland to deliver a groundbreaking PhD thesis on the construction, structure, and degradation of the architecture of woody plants. He carried that holistic insight into system dynamics into industry and emerged 50 years later as a world-class total quality excellence and change management consultant. Now at the age of 65, he makes his life skills available worldwide. As chairman of Human Nature Solutions, a transitional network of artisans, communicators, coaches, and other professionals dedicated to building human nature communities, to be served by networks like ourselves and by corporate governments, governmental and non-governmental organizations, private and public organizations co-align to one end, a thriving, living planet in all its beauty and diversity, safe from the absurd and diabolical human race to the bottom. So this is a very brief introduction to Dr. Guy R. Tanner. He had lots of other activities. Uh, so now I request Dr. Guy R. to deliver his valuable speech. Over to Dr. Guy Tanner, sir.
Well, thank you very much. I think, do I call you Dr. Nath or Dr. Sanjeev?
Yeah, you can say Dr. Nath.
The same. Okay, it's fine. As you can tell, the English tend to be very relaxed. We have an old saying, you know, keep calm and carry on. That's a very good saying at this point in time. Thank you very much for almost completely summarizing my presentation today. That was some introduction. It's a delight to be here. I must thank Dhing College for involving me, and of course our friends around the table. Without further ado, I'm conscious that I have just 15 minutes. I'm going to set a timepiece here in the hope that I achieve what I'm about to say. I'm going to go straight to screen sharing. There's a little bit of a diddle in between when you open the screen, but I hope it won't take long. I'm now switching to the presentation, which I hope will let me in to do this. So, here is my challenge for you as I take you on a world tour. It won't take long. We're sitting looking out into the universe, not from our planet, not even from my front room. From this, in this case, just below the moons of Saturn, as one of man's greatest endeavors, an unmanned spacecraft past the rings of Saturn. Sit back, relax. We're about to hit warp speed as we summarize the entire history of life on Earth, past, present, and future, in just 15 minutes. Just so anybody's feeling a little bit dizzy now, here's a reminder. This is the tipping point, and we are here. The blue planet. As described by an excellent fellow that I'll refer to in a moment called Sir David Attenborough. When I first did this slide, there was a line across here saying, "No, Raj, it's not about me. Now, my friends, it's not about me." This is an introduction to the gentleman who really tells the story. He, along with the Queen, have been the pillars of my existence for over 60 years. He started out at Cambridge doing natural sciences. In those days, people look at you like you're completely unserious if you've done anything other in the sciences, in engineering. Alternatively, should I say, took up the job of broadcasting. I was a child in 1955. In fact, I was just born. And he introduced to the little black and white radio with a picture on the front, a program called ZooQuest. The rest, as they say, is history. This great man is still broadcasting now. He set up a company called Planet Earth on the back of an ongoing series started in 2006 to educate the entire world on the state of life on Earth. Here he is. But he couldn't have done that if he was not stepping, walking, running on the shoulders of giants. One of them was Lynn Margulis. She was an internalist. She understood that inside every single cell in our body, there is a symbiosis going on between the mitochondria, which is sourced from bacterial, well, cyanobacteria actually, and our predecessors as a multi-cell organism. The other fine fellow here is James Lovelock. He was an expansionist in his mind. He saw the entire planet not just as a picture, but as a living, dynamic system. An education to us all. And it's that education that underpins everything I have to say on this subject. I have to admit it took me a long time to catch up. I'm not so bright as these people. In fact, at the age of 25, I decided deliberately to become a generalist. Not as a broadcaster, but as a student of life. In 2009, I'd already completed a significant period in my life where I had taught teams of people in the industrial environment, indeed the wider commercial environment, to operate together to solve problems. As a result of that, I was inducted into the fellowship of the Chartered Quality Institute. And I stood about to give a lecture about the quality of life when somebody pointed out that I was actually standing, sorry about this, on the very spot where Watson and Crick had introduced the structure of DNA. You can imagine how my knees wobbled on that occasion, as I told some rather stiff, grey-suited peers at this esteemed institute that one by one, the species of the planet were disappearing. This was prescient in 2009. People were not thinking like this. So I continued and said, you tell me which species is going to disappear next. Put your hand up. And the first person who put their hand up, I congratulated them. And I told them about the millions of biochemical miracles that had happened just to allow them to raise their hand. It's a marvelous world. And I continued from that period. I was curious about this planet I lived on. And I gave a series of talks, now called the Quality of Life workshops. And something began to dawn on me. First of all, the amount of land available to us human beings, self-obsessed, was rapidly disappearing. The beautiful planet that I saw only for the first time in the middle of the night with my pajamas on in 1969 was already being raped to the degree of 1.3 portions of its capability to deliver by every single human being on the planet. Shocking stuff. If you think that was shocking, round about then, there was this idea that somehow the Industrial Revolution, quote, had caused a dramatic rise in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Was that the problem? I really did not know. What I did realize as I looked at this chart is that where David Attenborough had been born at the peak of the first phase of the 20th century increase in temperature and carbon dioxide, I had been born at the start of the second phase. I do not know whether that makes me culpable of the situation we're in, but I guess I'm just one member of the human race. As a member of the human race, I got a lucky break. A guy called Al Gore was about to present to British industry his need for money to establish the Climate Reality Project. Don't ask me how, but I was sitting in the back of the crowd. I was the only one amongst 200, 250 industrialists who dared to ask a question. 3 days later, I was invited to Istanbul. I joined this wonderful, crazy bunch of people from every corner of the planet. There are two guys, at least here today, who were in this crowd. I'm not asking you to find them. We're there. But Mr. Gore is there. And during a series of 3 days, he quietly, assertively, firmly educated in just what a mess we were in. My feet never touched the floor. Apart from anything else, we were almost airlifted out of Istanbul as we had stepped into a major environmental riot going on in that great city because the last piece of greenery was being removed, and the more intelligent, informed people of that 4.5 million people objected, understandably. The fantastic thing that came out of that was I was suddenly connected with 92 nations worldwide, and immediately, because there was an insistence on our using Facebook, had over 200 friends. I stepped forward because I'm time traveling today and I've got a limited amount of time. 2019, the world population continued to grow, and it kind of played at the back of my mind. Species were becoming extinct, and still it was there concerning me, but to be honest, I'm only one guy. I was not sure what I could do about any of this, and more importantly, why it essentially mattered. Let me share it with you. Just last year, a remarkable fellow called Raj Furkan said, "Oh, you know, I'm just near you. Why don't you pop up and see me?" "Oh, where are you going to be?" "Oh, it's only in Oslo." Well, that's about 1,500 kilometers away from here, and it's a flight, and I don't like to fly. The next day, I bought my ticket, and we together went on an expedition. This was no ordinary expedition. In fact, Raju Khan, as I'm sure he's going to tell you, was just on his way back from Svalbard in the Arctic. I, on the other hand, was curious about the wonderful symbiotic relationship between the reindeer and the Sami people in Northern Europe. We Europeans, we are like anybody else. We only see the world immediately in front of us. What I wanted to show the world, starting with Europe, is that we have a piece of the Arctic that we are accountable for. So we set out 5,000 kilometers or so by train and public transport only over 11 days to connect all 5 cities in Scandinavian mainland with the Arctic that they were responsible for, are responsible for. There's some accolades on here I should not ignore, which say that we were sponsored. We were sponsored in the sense that, for example, Robert Swan sent us off on our journey. The Parvati organization inspired us. The Green Guard of India were there concerned about what we were doing. We did not take a single penny from anybody because it's built into the value system of my organization. We do not deal in money. Our currency is joy, and our objective is the continuation of life on Earth. Oh, just by way of a little bit of a cultural point of view here, we even popped in to see Father Christmas and consult him. And we have a video of me interviewing him about his view in relation to the prospect of the survival of the reindeer. Little did I know, and here's a sad note, whilst we were there, hundreds of reindeers on the island of Svalbard that Raj had just come back from died together instantaneously, caused by starvation due to climate change, the glazing over of rain, which barely ever happens that far north, over the lichen they depended on, resulted in starvation. It kind of focused my mind, but I wasn't sure what to do next. All of a sudden, 2020 came. It came in like a storm. We in Britain, we live at the north end of the amazing thermohaline circulation. Right next to us is the powerhouse. It's an extraordinary powerhouse. It generates not only this magnificent current, which keeps us connected with the world, it keeps Great Britain warm, inappropriately so, considering our place on this map. More importantly, it generates life. It is the spawning ground of billions of creatures every year, starting from phytoplankton. My clock tells me I'm almost out of time. Am I okay to carry on? Excuse me while I just shut it down. Am I okay to carry on, Mr. I'm okay? I got a thumbs up from Raj. I'm going to go quick, really quick. So we are right next to the blue blob. That is the outflow of fresh water from the Arctic straight into the Northern Atlantic. It means that that current is being overtaken even as we speak. This is a representation of anomalies in heat around the planet, global heating. Right now, and starting last winter, we are in the teeth of the jet stream. The jet stream has never, for this long, migrated south. So we are caught between what used to be called a rock and a hard place.
Guy, you have muted yourself, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, can I have 5 more minutes, please?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, you can have.
You're very kind, thank you. Okay, finishing this slide. This last slide here is in my hometown. It doesn't look too bad, except this is the top of the bridge over the river in our town. And now I seem to have lost control. Oh, okay. So we were just feeling quite good. Back in the end of 2019, these wonderful people, Greta and Sir David, found themselves on the stage of the COP. We were about to pull together our own party of the conferences to celebrate. Sadly, this year, it's suddenly become a more difficult proposition to entertain. Because at the same time, it's amazing how these natural coincidences come together. This monster, coronavirus, was released out of China through ignorance. It was then perpetuated across the planet through inaction. The net result is here and now, in Great Britain, that wonderful placid place, 367 people died yesterday. That brings the total number of people that have died on this placid little place off the northwest coast of Europe to 45,365 dead. This needs a shift of mindset. This is a very quick analysis of where we are at as a species. I want to talk very briefly about changing the entire behavior of the human race. Through habit, through the 20th century, the mind component of the mind, body, heart, and soul has taken precedent. The net result is those who control the engineers and the technicians and the scientists ask them to collect knowledge and then deliver answers, preferably yesterday and with huge profit. They even do it through the prism of touching our self-obsession, the body, and making use of the heart, the way we care about each other. The sale of cosmetics is a prime bad example. Look at your TV anytime and look at the adverts on there and see how this plays out. And the soul is kind of not very sociable, not very, what's the word for, fashionable these days. I can't speak for every culture on the planet, but I can speak for what is referred to as the West. This is wrong. We were not created in this way. Not we individually, but we as communities have within us the representation of that ability to concern for the generation of the next generation. That's not too many generations. Deep concern for the relationships within the cave, shall I say. The importance of recognizing that we need to plan and go out and collect the next mammoth if we are to survive. And overlying that, the concern and awareness that if we don't give something back, there will be no food next year. We see this many ways. I think the most poignant one is the recognition of beauty. What purpose does beauty have other than as a perception that this is a glorious place to live? Even 10 years ago, when I first gave the quality of life presentation, this was roughly the model I used. And my point was very simple, that as long as the capability to care, the capability to protect, the capability to do something about carbon emissions, and the capability to stop consumerism, if they were always blocked by a mass of indignation, of horror, of social media posts, 8 billion potential opinions, we were going to get nowhere. Somehow we have to align those same emotional, mental, psychological, actable instincts behind where they're effective. Eliminate the noise, eliminate the barriers, and move on. This isn't the first or the last time I will share this. It's a bit of an eye test. Simply what this says is if we are to survive, if the species around us, which by the way probably lost one while I was talking, are to survive, if there's any point in being on this planet, we have to invert the pyramid. We have to bring people together at local. I've used 1,000 simply because there are 8 billion human beings and 8 million species. We must bring them together to solve their own problems, underpin them with resource, underpin them with competence, underpin them with serious money, driven from a council of competent elders, people who really understand what is going on, and just do it. We have 1 year. Even today, the excellent Sir David Attenborough is broadcasting live on BBC iPlayer this message. 1 million species. 1/8 of the entire miracle of life is at risk from us. Next year, it's COP22, delayed by a whole year. Of all the things not to go online, delaying the conference was potentially a deadly threat. Oh, by the way, I did meet the reindeer. I had to go to Scotland to meet him. He lives in a reserve up on the Highlands, and he will be there at the COP if I can do anything about it. And so will we, Human Nature Solutions. We'll broadcast live from there to the entire world. That is my promise to you. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Guy.
My pleasure.
Yes.
Sorry about the overrun.
Yeah. So thank you very much for your resourceful and very interesting lecture, and hope that we will hear from you in future.
That would be my pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.
Yeah, thank you, sir, once again. So next, proceed to the next program, next session, that is deliberation by Rituraj Phukan. So before Rituraj Phukan delivers his lecture, let me give you a short biodata of Rituraj Phukan. Rituraj Phukan is an environmental writer, adventurer, and naturalist who belongs to Northeast India, Assam, a biodiversity-rich, climate change-impacted province in the northeast of India. As a national coordinator of biodiversity for the Climate Reality Project India, Chief Operating Officer of Walk for Water, and Secretary General of Green Guard Nature Organization. He facilitates awareness and actions on the 3 Ws: warming, water, and wildlife. Working with all stakeholders, including indigenous communities, students, civil society, business, and media, for a positive societal impact. Having worked extensively at the grassroots, he says water is a local issue of global climate change for people and for biodiversity. He is driven by concerns over glacial loss in the water towers of Asia and is currently working on an initiative to mobilize civil society action in the countries of the Himalayan region. He is a member of the International Union for Conservation of Nature and holds leadership positions in several international and national environmental groups. He has delivered presentations and talks in Malaysia, Norway, Sweden, Finland, South Africa, and Bangladesh, and participated in deliberations in the USA, Canada, Argentina, Denmark, Thailand, and Turkey. Rituraj was personally trained as a climate reality leader by Nobel laureate Al Gore and was featured in the former US Vice President's 2007 book, An Inconvenient Sequel, Truth to Power. Rituraj is a member of the International Union for Conservation of Nature and sits on the board of civil society groups in the Americas, Europe, and Australia. He has personally experienced the impacts of climate change in Antarctica and across the Arctic region. So here's a glimpse of his activities. So now I request Rituraj Pukan to deliver his valuable lecture. Over to Rituraj Pukan.
Thank you, Sanjeev. That was an extensive introduction. And yeah, it's a hard act to follow after the brilliant Dr. Guy Tanner and his presentation. But I'm glad I structured my own presentation today around a theme of telling your own story, just like Guy did, and just like uh, the incredible Mr. Attenborough does. So I'm going to intertwine the extensive story of polar warming impacts and implications for us around my own story, which starts in a small town on this blue marble that Guy had earlier referred to. This is probably the most famous picture of the Earth, and the reason why it's called the blue marble is because of the amount of water we have. We'll come to that later, but to my friends who are watching from around the world, this is Assam. This is, famous for greenery and the one-horned rhinos. But when I was growing up, it was a state in trouble. There was civil war-like situation, and this kind of got me thinking about why people would want to uh, come from a different country to your own region, and then that would result in different kinds of conflict. So to search for answers, I went on perhaps the longest journey of my life, uh, literally halfway or more across the world, and then across the turbulent waters of the Drake Passes to the Antarctic Peninsula. And my own climate story starts here. I'm going to show you a very short clip because this was my first lesson. Well, those were penguins, and those are the first penguins I saw after landing at Antarctica. But if you have noticed, there were huge bones lying all over Antarctica, on the beaches, and there were remains of fishing boats from a time when the continent, the remotest, farthest continent on Earth, the only uninhabited one where there are no permanent humans, uh, still carries the marks of an age when people used to just go there and hunt the whales. That was my first lesson, that no place on Earth is safe from us human beings. So that is where my climate journey started, actually, this was my first climate activity, and I was standing in solidarity on March the 2nd, 2013, with the Pacific Islands Warrior Day of Action, which was organized by 350.org to highlight the threats faced by 15 small Pacific nations, which will be the first to be drowning due to sea level rise. And what better place than the Western Antarctica Peninsula to understand sea level rise and the implications of warming at the two polar regions. In fact, earlier this year, in February, uh, the temperature in the West Antarctic Peninsula was over 20 degrees Celsius. I mean, you don't associate plus 2-3 degree is the highest you get in the summer, but you don't associate 20 degrees Celsius with Antarctica. These are the kind of changes we are talking about. Moving on, we hiked across the continent and crossed glaciers, uh, found these huge icebergs that are floating all around Antarctica, camped under the southern uh, skies under the Aurora Australis, and went to a lot of penguin rookeries to look at what climate change is affecting the fragile ecosystems there. We got very close to wildlife, and some of them actually too close for comfort, but we learned a lot of lessons. The next thing that I understood was that not all life forms are impacted in a similar way. Even within the penguins, there are certain species like the Adelie penguins, which have been uh, very badly affected due to the changes in their habitat, with about 50% loss in the past 50 or so years. Whereas the Gentoo penguin, which doesn't need so much of sea ice, their populations have actually increased. And those were Gentoo penguins that you saw in the clip that I showed earlier. However, this February again, there is more bad news out of Antarctica. Entire colonies are now in trouble. Entire species, including the emperor and the other Antarctic penguins that were supposed to be safe back then, are all now facing the threat of climate change. I think the most profound lesson I got during the expedition to Antarctica, uh, which was a great life-changing moment for me, was to be able to see the remains of the Larsen B Ice Shelf. Now, this happened in 2002. At that time, not many people believed in climate change. And when this ice shelf started to crack, scientists were of the opinion that something that was geologically stable for tens of thousands of years would probably take years to actually break away. Unfortunately, once it started to crack, within a few weeks, the entire Larsen B ice shelf collapsed. 11 years later, in the Antarctic Sound area, we could still see those tabular icebergs of massive proportions at a place called the Antarctic Sound, where they are not supposed to be there, but these are actually the remnants of the Larsen B ice shelf. It opened my eyes to the threat of sea level rise. And very soon, just a year later, we understood that the entire West Antarctic ice sheet where we had visited is actually going into irreversible retreat. Uh, in the past couple of years, we know that the Thwaites Glacier, again, one of the largest glaciers, which is so huge that it could cause up to over 1 meter of sea level rise, is actually in the process of collapsing. And a very recent report again, 60% of all the ice shelves are at the risk of fracture. These are really bad news, and we look at the implications for our region later. But my climate journey continues when I rolled into Churchill on perhaps the world's only climate impacted train journey, which unfortunately now has either been discontinued or runs only on a few days during the entire year. And this is actually from Canada. The line between the train tracks between Winnipeg and Churchill, which goes over permafrost, and because of the unstable uh, permafrost, the tracks have become uh, unsafe to use due to the warming. And the first thing I noticed, the first creature we saw after we rolled into the town called Churchill was this polar bear. You can see the train tracks behind. In fact, Churchill is known as the polar bear capital of the world and for a region. Last year, some of you would remember that a town in Russia saw an invasion of polar bears. But out there in the Hudson Bay area, the polar bears are entering into town repeatedly because the Hudson Bay is melting so much faster in the year and freezing much later. This is where we stayed at Churchill Northern Studies Center, one of the main areas where a lot of studies about permafrost melting, about ecological impacts of the Arctic melting are taking place. And I was fortunate enough to take part in a lot of these studies, including this mesocosm, where we are looking at the effect of uh, very minor changes in temperature and how they affect the wetland dynamics, the growth of tadpoles, the survival of two species of skittlefish and uh, two species of frogs that actually survived the Arctic freezing for 8 months, as well as how the tundra is changing, how the boreal forests are expanding upwards or northwards in the entire region. So this is the International Tundra Experiment, or the ITEX. I think some of the botanists here would be very interested to know how warming is actually impacting the vegetation across the world. It will be incomplete if I do not mention the polar bear jail. This is perhaps the only one of its kind, and a pointer to our relationship with nature, I guess, because of repeated intrusion into uh, town. Polar bears are actually caught and put into this facility for up to 2-3 months, and when the winter comes, they're released back. This is not, of course, the future we want. This is a nice polar bear that I clicked out there. Uh, and the beluga whales, which is again another of those iconic species of the Arctic, which are now threatened because predators like the orcas, which usually do not venture out into the cold water, are now moving north. Coming to a few other expeditions, this is the Arctic expedition that Guy was mentioning earlier. We went on the National Geographic Explorer accompanied by Robert Swan. And Guy, you mentioned this episode of the Svalbard reindeer deaths. So this was actually during the week in June. I was there. About 200 of them starved to death after it rained, and the hard ice covered the vegetation that they feed on, and they are of course adapted to digging through the snow and not the hard ice. So these are the ecological changes we are witnessing across the Arctic. We saw very less of the sea ice. We went right up to the 80-degree north. Uh, However, across the landscape, we could see that black soot has been uh, deposited in many parts of uh, the Arctic, and the albedo effect of the snow has been um, replaced by this dark ice. And that's having a huge impact on polar bears as well as walruses and other inhabitants of the Arctic region. And this was, of course, the reindeer rising expedition that Dr. Guy and myself uh, went on about 2,500 miles by public transport. And he has already mentioned this, so I'm not going to talk about it. But we did engage with uh, various stakeholders across the region, starting with the flag off by Rob Swan at Oslo, and then a broadcast from We Don't Have Time headquarters at Stockholm, then meeting up with different local stakeholders at the Copenhagen as well as Helsinki. And then, of course, from Rovaniemi, we are joined by Vandana, rider of Parvati Foundation, and we talked, among other things, about the Marine Arctic Peace Sanctuary as an effective and immediately applicable response to the climate and ecological crisis. We'll come back to that later. But yeah, so why are we talking about polar warming so much? Because the polar regions are basically the air conditioners of our planet. And we need the polar regions for life to exist on Earth. Unfortunately, uh, the air conditioners have been melting. We are losing the sea ice at a rapid rate, and this graph shows uh, the extensive loss documented since the 1980s. So I'm going to move on and see, this is the difference we see. We might see the total loss of summer sea ice within the next 10 years. In fact, the entire Arctic region has now transitioned into a carbon emitter rather than being a carbon sink. Uh, of course, there are various kinds of impact, and I'd first look at the melting itself actually is going to cause warming. And the scientists recently calculated that it could add zero point 0.4 degrees. Now, you can add to the expected bare minimum of 1.5 degrees Celsius warming above pre-industrial levels that we are about to reach, plus 4.4 degrees that will be added due to the dark seawater replacing the white snow. So the loss of albedo and the vicious cycle of warming is evident here. That is, of course, going to have a huge impact on sea level rise. And as somebody said, the maps of the world will have to be redrawn. This was actually about 10 years back, maybe more, when the entire cabinet of the Maldives had a meeting underwater to focus on rising seawater levels. I mean, people were aware of this 11 years back, but nothing has actually happened. Now, if we add up the Antarctic and Greenland ice shelves, if all of it were to melt, of course, sea levels will rise by over 60 meters. Coming back to the implications for our region, just 1 meter sea level rise will actually displace the 15 million people in the neighboring country. And we know we have had issues in our region due to the influx of displaced people in the past. And uh, believe me, there is no border fencing or security force that could actually prevent the influx of more people if they are displaced by rising sea levels, as is expected in the future. There are, of course, a lot of other impacts. One of the most significant is that the loss of sea ice will hit the Indian monsoon. That means that we are going to see disruption of the monsoon rains, the most dependable thing in India, perhaps so important for food security, for agriculture, that disruption is already happening actually. There was another news about how aerosol is been deposited across the Tibetan plateau, and that, of course, is going to accelerate the melting of glaciers across the Tibetan plateau, and that is so important because the Tibetan plateau plays a key role in supplying the perennial rivers of the entire region. I think about 40% of the global population live in this region. The most populous countries of China, India, Bangladesh, Pakistan are all dependent on the water from these rivers. This was a assessment report that came out last year, and this actually was the first to raise the alarm on how badly the glaciers are being affected. It's warming as fast as the polar regions, that is like twice as fast as the rest of the world. And even if we are to contain warming at 1.5 degree, the implications for India's northeastern region is immense, because we are going to lose 64%, two-thirds of our glaciers anyhow, even if we are to control warming. And if we do not control the warming and it goes on like it is now, we will lose about 95%. Unfortunately, the region has already warmed by 1.3 degrees Celsius. So we expect to lose about 40% of the glaciers uh, in the next 20 years. That will have a lot of impact on the floods and erosion that we are already experiencing across Assam and other parts of Northeast India. Now, at this moment, if you look at the India map and the water stress, we see that Northeast India is not at all there in the map. But considering the impact, these are some headlines from around India. Considering that the Hindu Kush Himalaya assessment report predicts that we are going to lose our glaciers, and this will have huge implications for water security in Assam and the rest of the Northeast. One database prediction made a few years back actually said that one of the regions likely to see water wars in the future is the Ganga Brahmaputra basin, which is quite unthinkable at this moment because we have an abundance of water rather than scarcity. But this is the future we are looking at. Now, I always say that water is the local issue of global climate change for people and for biodiversity. And this is an aspect I think has been ignored in most narratives. You can see these headlines. I mean, these are from mainstream newspapers across India. And Assam, where we live, I'm going to look at three of our iconic animals because they are so much dependent on water. Their lives are dependent on, water and the vegetation that they survive on. Elephants not only are they very susceptible to high temperatures, but also to disease, and they need a lot of water. So they are suffering from climate change. We are not going to dwell on this, but the other aspect is that if the grasslands are disappearing in some places because of changes in rainfall, the vegetation change that everybody is talking about these days, and when the prey base, the deer that the tiger hunts, moves to another place, the tiger is often unable to follow the prey because of fragmented habitats, as well as because they are very territorial, and there is often another big cat living in those protected habitats. The rhino, of course, we started with our pride, or the animal that everybody identifies with Assam. In fact, in Nepal, they are now predicting that the rhinos are going to shift into India because the grasslands are changing. This is another of the vegetation change that uh, is coming into the narrative more and more. In fact, the entire Hindu Kush Himalayas is going to see a drastic loss of biodiversity. This, by the way, is one of the most important biodiverse areas in the entire world. For the botanists in the group, if you refer to the studies that have been published just in the last couple of months about the huge vegetation changes that is taking place across North America, across the Himalayas, and other regions around the world. This is something I think is going to have a huge implications on human wildlife conflicts, and as well as food security for not just for human beings, but as well as for all kinds of wild animals. Now, one more impact. I just saw this a couple of days back. The Laptop Sea area is one of the oldest areas, and a huge place where the sea ice, actually, it's known as the sea ice factory because that's where sea ice is formed every year. But till the last report, which came in last week, the freezing has not started, and it has never happened before. So this is going to have a lot of repercussions, and the Arctic sea ice actually plays a crucial role in the Earth's energy balance uh, because it's covered by snow, which is the brightest natural surface on the planet, and that albedo effect of reflecting about 80% of the solar radiation. Uh, that is lost to the dark natural surface of the oceans, which tends to absorb more heat. So this is a cyclic, the Arctic amplification that people talk about. So this is the Laptop Sea area. So this is the lowest in the last 40 years. So we have lost about half of the sea ice. So I briefly mentioned the Marine Arctic Peace Sanctuary. This is a sanctuary proposed under the United Nations Convention on Laws of the Sea by the Parvati Foundation, and this wants to protect, the treaty wants to protect it proposes to protect all the areas north of the marine areas north of the Arctic Circle for posterity, to protect these areas from exploitative tourism, mining, uh, and drilling, etc. Because these activities could aggravate what is already happening in the Arctic, because the Arctic sea ice is very important for global weather, and what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. It affects us all, as we have already seen during this narrative. Now, I'm going to end with a couple of slides. One is from Robert Swan, who actually led one of the expeditions I went to in the Arctic, as well as the Antarctic expedition. And he says the greatest threat is the planet to the planet is the belief that someone else will save it. Uh, then one more quote, and this is going to be my final slide. And this is from, of course, James Lovelock. And I can see Guy smiling because, yes, the Gaia, and he is a great proponent of Gaia. And we always must remember it's not the planet that we are going to save. It's the challenge is to save ourselves, save humankind, to save uh, the species. It's just about us, because the planet is going to look after itself. So with that, I end my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Rituraj Fukan, for your outstanding deliberation, your experience. And before we end up, here are some questions for you and Dr. Guy. So the very first question is for Rituraj Fukan. Is it audible? Rituraj?
Yes, it is audible.
What are the highlights of India's Antarctic and Arctic policy? It's for you.
Okay. Well, the Indian Antarctic program is carried out under the control of the National Center for Antarctic and Ocean Research, and I think it was initiated in 1981 with the first Indian expedition to Antarctic. And so India signed the Antarctic Treaty and has a base called Gangotri, Dakhin Gangotri, which was built in 1983. And I think in 1990, that was replaced by a base called Maitri. And a third research station, Bharati, is now being built there. And Antarctic policy for India is to study basically the fauna and the molecular biodiversity of the continent. And I think about 120 plus new microbes have been discovered around that place. And coming to the Arctic, India began its Arctic region back in 1920, actually, and India was a signatory to the Svalbard Treaty. And then the Arctic research program focuses totally on climate change, and it wants to understand the relation between the Arctic climate and the Indian monsoon. So that's the focus area. And India has a research base at a place called Nai Elesund in Svalbard, which is known as Himadri. And in 2012, India was also elected to the Council for the International Arctic Science Committee. So, it was granted an observer status a few years back to the Arctic Council. So, yeah, that's about India's Arctic and Antarctic policy.
Thank you, Fukan. Now, here's a question for Guy, sir. What is the way forward for a sustainable future of mankind? I repeat, what is the way forward for a sustainable future of mankind?
Okay. First of all, it's quite interesting working with Rituraj Fukan, because he's very good at knowledge and I'm only good at understanding, perception, and implication. So it's a good question. Thank you, sir. It's really a question that we collectively shall address to the world between now and the COP in a year's time. In fact, a year this Friday. There is no straight answer. What I do know is it shall require 8 billion people to be mobilized, every single one of us. It needs to be a structured response in which we put priority on the survival of all species in the future above everything else. In this, the core of your question is in a way an indication that you and I are both human, because we see it all from a human point of view. The very point of my first slide was to say, that is what we have been doing 4,500 years, and it brought us to where we are now. We have to modify the way we look at things. We have to organize, we have to cooperate, we have to co-align. Even if you believe that somebody on the other side of the planet is against what we're trying to achieve, find some way of redirecting their energy towards that one objective, which is arresting extinction. There is no other agenda.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. So the next question is for Raj Fukan. What is the role of youth in the modern environment movement, and what can our students do for the planet?
That's a incredible question, because I think, and I have always believed that the environment movement has always been inspired by the youth, and the climate movement at this moment, of course, knows Greta Thunberg and Fridays for Future movement. But back in 1992, it was Severn Cullis Suzuki from Canada who actually made the world leaders stop and listen to her speech about saving the planet, about the environmental movement. I think that was one of the most powerful speeches ever, and she was just 12 years old. And later on, the Earth Day Network was again inspired by a lot of young people. And back in 2007, it was 9-year-old Felix Fink Berner from Germany who set up Plant for the Planet. And he was talking about planting millions of trees at a time. I don't think anybody was, actually focusing on such a huge mass plantation as a response to the environmental crisis. And within a few years, he was able to inspire action around the world. And I think by now he must have surpassed about 100 million trees or so. In India, we have our own Riddhima Pandey, who 3 or 4 years back filed a case, a civil suit against the government of India for inaction on climate change. So whether we look at the global scenario or in India, we always have had the youth. And I believe students across the colleges and even the schools need to be taught about the interconnections between the climate crisis and the things, the manifestations that we are seeing across India and in Assam. For example, whereas many parts of India are suffering from the water crisis, in Assam we have floods and erosions which have increased in frequency as well as intensity, and as well as a lot of human-wildlife conflicts. Which I believe is also connected to the climate crisis, because with vegetation change, lack of adequate food and water sources, wildlife tend to stray from protected areas and making them more vulnerable to poaching as well as conflicts. So yes, the students need to make these interconnections, and I think we could learn from you know so many great teachers that each one teach one and carry this movement forward. So that would be my message. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So here we have can you
We lost you, sir.
Can you
You're
repeat?
back.
Brenda? Okay. Brenda,
Yes,
can you
hello.
just elaborate? Yeah.
So thanks so much for the chance to speak. I really appreciated hearing Guy and Rituraj both because, of course, I've had the wonderful opportunity to connect with both of them through the Marine Arctic Peace Sanctuary. And I feel that they've both touched on aspects of what MAPS does. I wanted to also highlight another aspect of interconnection for India and the poles that I found. And Raj, you could probably speak to this as well. And that is the immense amount of heat in the world's oceans that has become concentrated in the Indian Ocean in a way that is very much out of balance because, of course, all of the ocean systems, you know, they're flowing into each other. You touched on this as well, Guy. And so now that there's less cold up in the Arctic Ocean, all of the temperature balances have gone out of whack, and somehow the Indian Ocean itself has become this immense heat reservoir. And that leads not just to the water shortages. Yes, it disrupts the monsoon. It also contributes to sea surface temperatures, generate cyclonic storms. So then you get the really devastating cyclones. And you also get, as you get increased rainfall patterns in certain areas that don't usually get it, such as the Arabian Peninsula of Africa, you've had a massively increased amount across Africa, and I understand in India too, of locusts that are devastating crops. And just so there's a connection with all of these things that it goes beyond really our human capacity to measure. We just discover a little tiny corner of it more every day. And so for Parvati Foundation, our approach is really that everything is interconnected. And as both of your speakers touched on today, we need to remember that. And I love the quote by James Lovelock that, yeah, Earth's capacity to regenerate it's uncharted. We do not begin to understand the power that nature has. We need to give it a chance. That's what MAPS is about. MAPS is really about two things because yes, it is the circle around the geographical area that says, okay, everybody out, stop breaking the ice. Do not take out Arctic oil and gas when we know that that has to stay in the ground. Do not kill the whales that we know need to keep giving us air. It's that. It is also the necessary global pivot. You touched on this as well, Guy. The necessary global pivot in each of our thinking to sustain it. And that's Parvati Foundation's committed to both. We are all in this mess that we're in because of the way we've each been thinking. And that's determining our actions, and our actions have been disconnected from their consequences. And now the consequences come back to us in pretty awful ways. It's like, imagine if you're on a balcony, on the 10th floor balcony, and you smoke a cigarette and you throw the butt off the balcony, it lands on someone else's balcony and you don't notice, oh, why is my neighbor's balcony on fire? Well, I guess he doesn't manage it very well. You know, so we really need to pay attention to the fact that we are interconnected. And that's what we're doing through MAPS and through global education for us to reawaken everybody's inherent interconnection. Yes, 8 billion people. Yes, every heart, every human, that we remember that we are interconnected and that each one of us has the ability to make a difference. And when we're willing to break out of our old patterns, stop kidding ourselves that we cannot change or it's not our problem, that's when transformation happens and MAPS in a healthy world are realized. I did want to touch on one other point because Guy, you so beautifully brought up the reindeer. There's one other threat that I've noticed to the reindeer, and Guy, I'm sure you're familiar with this, and that is anthrax. They call it in Russia, they call it the Siberian Plague. And we know that unfortunately the Arctic permafrost is melting, as Raj pointed out. And when that melts, there are pathogens buried in it. It's actually also happening in Tibet. There are pathogens buried under the ice, and the ice has been preserving them very well. For tens, thousands, even millions of years, a bacteria can live, virus can live tens of thousands of years. Anthrax from hundreds or thousands of years ago comes back to the surface, reanimates, and suddenly it destroys a reindeer herd. It can destroy humans too, because any kind of virus or pathogen is going to be buried with organic matter. And the other thing that's buried in the permafrost is methane, and that comes from organic matter. So you can often find them together. And methane, if it comes out in a really big burst, which it can, then it can disperse that pathogen much further. So just one more connection to keep in mind. Anyway, I wasn't scheduled, so I don't want to take up too much time, but those were a couple points that I wanted to add in. And if anyone has questions, I'm happy to stick around.
Thank you, Pranada. And those were two aspects I think I missed out on. Methane. Just today, earlier today, me and Guy were discussing about the methane bomb that's supposed to be at the verge of exploding across the Arctic, and of course the anthrax threat, and who knows how many viruses are buried there, and which could be worse than this coronavirus uh, threat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ranga, for your informative information as regards map. So we have almost come to the end of this webinar. So we'll end up with a vote of thanks. So at the very outset, I would like to thank Dr. Guy, our tenor, for his informative and valuable delivery. Apart from that, I also thank him for sharing his experience and making his lecture very interesting. Now I would like to thank Rituraj Fukan, my friend, for sharing his information on climate change. And at last, I would like to thank Pranda for your information as regards maps. I now thank Dr. Biman Hajarika, our principal of our college, who were very cooperative and encouraged every time to organize such webinars. And I thank my technician, Oman Singh Raja, for supporting all the way. And I hope in future we will again meet you and hear from you and get precious information. Thank you very much for being with us. Thank you very much.
Thank
And
you.
yes, sir.
May I come in?
Yeah.
I have a wonderful gentleman I can share with you.
Yes, sir.
I think he will allow us to close out this talk very, very nicely.
Yeah.
If you have finished everything else, this is Sir David Attenborough himself.
Yeah.
Okay?
Yeah. Thank you very much.
I hope it plays.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate that.
So thank you very much, Dr. Guy, for your video. So we have already come to the end. Once again, thank you very much for being with us this afternoon and giving a lot of information and sharing your experience. Thank you very much once again. So with these words, I end up here.
Thank you. Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you very much. See you next time.
Yeah, definitely.